Hey everyone, I'm Sukan. I'm one of the managing partners at Iterative. Today I'm talking about a common question we get all the time: what you should do before you start a startup. Before we go into what you should do, let's define what starting a startup is, because I think it's kind of non-obvious to people. I think of uh, starting a startup, there's like two milestones that happen before that. The first one is before you validate an idea. And so this is the phrase where you're like coming up with an idea you think might be a good idea. And then there's a bunch of work that you should do to kind of validate the idea. And then there's the milestone that comes after that, which is trying to make a decision about whether you should quit your job or not. And I want to make sure that when people are listening to this, they know that we're primarily talking about the step where you're trying to figure out whether you should quit your job or not, and you should not be thinking about that before you validate. So, to me, the steps are: you should validate your idea first. Then, based on the evidence that you get from the validation, then you can think about whether it's worth it to quit your job and kind of take the plunge or not. And the rest of our conversation here, I think today, is going to be actually about assuming you've done validation and assuming you have some level of evidence that this is something that is worth quitting your job about. But if you don't have that evidence, please do not quit your job. But this conversation is going to be assuming that you have that evidence. Yeah, I think to me, the definition is like pretty straightforward. Like, you are a founder the moment that you quit your job and you full time are working on your startup. I think oftentimes people ask me about like what makes a founder or what is different about founders. If you quit your job, you started a startup. That's the definition to me. Two separate steps and two separate milestones to me about making this. So the first one is, you obviously start with kind of an idea and you want to get some information and evidence, which we call validation, that the idea that you're working on is promising. I never kind of advise people to quit their job if they don't have evidence that something is promising or not. So the first step is you have an idea, go do some validation. You can do it in part-time, nights and weekends, to get evidence that your idea is promising. If your idea looks promising, then the question that you got to ask yourself is it promising enough to quit your job? And if the answer is yes, then you still have to do a set of things to kind of make sure that you're prepared to do that. It's not just like, okay, I think this is promising, I'm going to quit my job. There's a set of things that you should do, which I think we're going to talk about. Maybe I'll break it down into kind of like, what does the first day feel like? What does the first week feel like? And then what's the first month and maybe the first 3 months? The first day is the best. It is the absolute best. Every first day of being a founder in my life is kind of like, one of the best days. And I think one of the reasons why it's the best day is that if you're deciding to be a founder, it's like something you've been thinking about for a long time. It's scary. You're trying to muster the courage. And if it's your first day, you have mustered the courage. You have done the scary thing that you've always wanted to do. And whether you admit it to yourself or not, there's a small part of you where you're like, this is the first day of me being the next Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk or whoever it is. Like, this is the start of your journey. And it's all optimism. And a lot of startups and being a founder is about optimism. And first days are optimism, right? You're getting started. Nothing has gone wrong. No one has rejected you. Nobody has told you that you're being dumb. It's all great. So the first day is fantastic. Please enjoy it. After the first week, I think it's going to start wearing off a little bit, because after the first week, you're going to feel like, okay, 1 week in, what have I actually done? Right? Like, I need to have done something, right? I've spent a whole week on this. What have I actually done? And I think what you're going to run into is that first week that you spent was probably relatively unstructured. Like, you probably just kind of like worked when you felt like working and kind of didn't. And you're kind of feeling out what that's like. And most jobs are very structured and this one is not. And so that first week is going to feel very unstructured. And frankly, you're probably going to get distracted a lot. So a lot of the things that you work on your first week, in my experience, are things that are just like not that important. So if you spent your first week talking to investors, sorting out your legal entity, setting up a bank account, all of that kind of stuff, it's kind of productive, but like none of that stuff is actually important. The only thing that are kind of important is everything related to users. So talking to users, trying to get more users, getting feedback from users, but it's fine. Like your first week, you probably didn't work on the right things. And then the third part of it is, if you're a founder and it's your first week, after the first week, you're going to find out that like, oh man, I need to be more self-disciplined than I like thought I was capable of or needed to be at this point. Because first weekend, you're going to look at all the stuff that you've done and you're going to be like, ooh, don't know if I did enough stuff. And then you're gonna have this really weird moment where you're gonna be like, how much stuff should I be doing? Like, what is a good pace for a startup and for a startup founder? Um, and I think you're not gonna have like panic mode within that first week, but you're gonna start grappling with some of these questions and problems, and you're gonna start kind of figuring it out. So, first day, best day of your life. First week, reality sets in a little bit. You're going to kind of understand what the problems are, but still fine, right? It's only the first week. First month, I think everything is really going to get set in. So if you didn't figure out the structure thing, you didn't figure out the self-discipline, and you didn't figure out what are the important things to do, the first month, it's going to be really obvious that you didn't figure out those things. And it's going to be really hard to kind of like talk yourself into that you did when you kind of really didn't. The first month, you've also likely, hopefully, talked to some users. Against Sukan's best advice, you probably talked to some investors. You probably talked to some friends about your ideas. Like, people are now, you've talked about what you're working on. And what you're probably going to get from that is rejection. Like, people are probably going to tell you that the idea is not that good. They can't believe they quit your job for it. Whether they actually say it to your face or not, you can read it on their face. You're going to tell your friend, I quit my job to do the new version of Instagram or TikTok. They're going to smile at you and be like, that's great. And what their face is going to tell you is like, I can't believe you quit your job to work on the next version of TikTok. And so I think that's going to be kind of painful and kind of demoralizing a little bit, that level of kind of rejection. I'm also betting that your first month, it's going to not have gone as well as you thought it was going to be. You probably thought, outside chance I get, 1 million users in my first month. I'm a rocket ship. I'm going to be on the cover of Forbes in the next kind of like 6 months here. And practically what ended up happening is you probably got 10 users and none of them are using your product anymore. And it's going to feel like you have failed. And that's part of the experience. It doesn't mean that you've kind of done anything wrong. It doesn't mean that you're being a bad founder. That's just how every founder feels. And I think that's just par for the course. And then I think 3 months after that is just going to be like cycles of that, right? So that first month, you're going to feel a lot of failure. You're going to feel a lot of rejection. You're going to feel like you didn't move fast enough. And the 3 months are just going to be that over and over and over. And I think the overarching feeling you're going to get at the end of these 3 months, or at a lot of points in between those 3 months, is you're going to feel really dumb. You're going to feel like you started out to do this thing, to change the world or whatever it is, chase your dream. And at the end of these kind of 3 months, the overarching feeling you're going to have is, I have no idea what I'm doing. Other people think what I'm doing is stupid. I kind of think that what they think is probably right. And even if I don't think the idea is stupid, I don't know how to make it happen. And so you're just going to not know what to do, and you're going to feel really dumb. I know that sounds like a really horrible experience, and why would anybody sign up for it? I promise you, there is fulfilling parts to this, and I'm going to help out and kind of like give advice on what we can do to kind of like make that experience not as painful. Caveat here, it's still going to be painful. If you think I'm going to give you some level of advice to make it so that you never experience failure, you never experience rejection, and you don't feel dumb, it's not going to happen. There's no way to do that. In part, being a founder is like, it's almost kind of like a Fight Club kind of like insider group. And the reason that makes that insider group strong and kind of tight, and whenever you meet another founder, you kind of look at each other and you're like, okay, we kind of like understand. The reason why that's the case is because it's so tough when you meet another person who decided to make that decision, has gone through those tough periods, and you can talk to them about it. You feel like you're talking to somebody who's kind of like one of you. And so it's kind of like a rite of passage almost, which again, doesn't mean that it needs to be painful for pain's sake. And we're going to do our best to give you guys a checklist for what you can do to prepare yourself to start a startup. I prepared a checklist of things that you should do before you start a startup to help you get prepared. Keep in mind that these are not in any kind of order or any order of priority. They're just things that you should, I recommend that you do before you start a startup. Number one, I said this at the very top, but make sure that you validated your idea before you start. The way that I think about validating ideas is that you want to get empirical evidence, ideally numerical evidence, that what you're working on is a good idea and is something that you should pursue. I think a lot of times founders think about validating an idea is that if an investor will give me money, then I should work on a startup. But there's a step that comes way before that, which is you need to find evidence to convince yourself that it is worth the risk that you are taking. And that's the whole purpose of validating an idea. Can I get evidence? Can I get information and data that suggests that this idea is worth me taking this risk? So you should be the first skeptic for your idea. Find evidence that this is something that you should do. So that's number one. Number two, you want to understand your motivations. So this is actually a question that we ask at Iterative to founders all the time is, why are you working on this startup? Why are you deciding to work on startups? And having a really good understanding of your motivations will help you when you hit those low points, especially in those first 3 months that I talked about. It tends to be that people who are internally motivated, or at least starting startups for internal reasons, are more resilient than external reasons. Let me define what those are. External reasons are you are doing a startup for things like you want to be famous, or you want to make a lot of money, or you want people to think you're cool. Those are external things that you are trying to get by doing a startup. People who do it for those reasons, and I'm not making moral judgments here, people can do stuff for whatever they want, but in our experience, they tend to be less resilient. And the reason why they tend to be less resilient is, let's say you're doing a startup because you're trying to make a lot of money. Most of the time in startups, it does not feel like you're going to make a lot of money. And in fact, you're probably going to lose a lot of money. And so if that is the reason you're doing a startup, you're probably going to quit in those moments. And even in the case that your startup ends up making a lot of money, you probably don't stick around for that because you just couldn't get through the bumps, right? Internal motivation is you are starting a startup because of something that is intrinsic within you and is not dependent on external things. So examples of this is sometimes people start a startup because they really care about solving a problem. It has nothing to do with the outside world. They just care about that. Some people start a startup because they think it's a really interesting experience and they want to have that experience. Again, something that comes from inside. The reason why we believe that internally motivated people are more resilient is because those things that I just said, you really want to solve a problem, or you really think that experience is interesting, are not outcome driven. And since they are not outcome driven, they still hold no matter how badly it's going. So for me, I've been primarily always kind of been fascinated by the experience, and I always found startups to be like one of the best ways for me to learn about a host of things, but also kind of personal development. And that tends to be true even if the startup is going well, or even when it's going bad. And frankly, I actually get more personal development, more learnings when the startup is bad. And so that's helped me stay working on startups for that, I don't know, 15 or 17 years that I've done it, because even through the bad times, I'm actually getting more out of the reason why I started a startup in the bad times than even the good times. And so that tends to be the case. So number two, you want to have a good understanding of what your motivations are, whether those are internally or externally motivated. Hopefully they're internally motivated. If you don't have a good understanding of those motivations, when the times get tough, you're going to start asking yourself why you're doing this. And if you don't have an answer, it's going to be easier to quit. So before you make the plunge, try to have a good understanding of why you want to start a startup. Number three, find a co-founder. We're going to have a separate module on finding co-founders, being a co-founder, is why you should have co-founders. But maybe just very quickly here, finding a co-founder is helpful because it helps you and your startup be more resilient. I think two people together working on something is more resilient than one person. And so finding a co-founder helps with the resiliency. The second piece of it too is accountability works better here. It turns out, and I like to think of myself as someone who's kind of like very disciplined, but even myself, it's like I have that nagging voice where it's like, oh, I worked really hard. I'm going to take this Tuesday off and play the new Zelda game, which I love, by the way. It's just easy to do that. But if I have a commitment that I made to Brian, who's been my co-founder for a very long time, about something that I'm going to accomplish by the end of the week, I kind of just don't feel as good about playing the Zelda game and taking the afternoon off because, look, I promised Brian that I was going to do this thing. I got to do this thing. I think the surprising thing here is that oftentimes you are more accountable to another person than you are to yourself, which has always kind of been surprising to me. I always kind of wish that they should care about being accountable to themselves more than somebody else. But I think practically that's just kind of not how human beings are. And so I think having a co-founder helps with that. And then the third part is it gives you some sort of structure to kind of like talk about what you need to do and what the priorities are. So having a co-founder, I think, works in your benefit for a lot of the things that I talked about in the first section about what that experience is going to be like. Helps with accountability, helps with self-discipline, gives you some structure. And frankly, for all the emotional parts about failure, rejections, feeling dumb, it's just kind of nice having another human being who is receiving the same amount of rejection, facing the same level of failures, and equally feeling dumb. And at least you can feel dumb together. And that is completely underrated. So I think having a co-founder, if you can find one, is great. Number 4, this is very practical. You want to calculate your personal runway. There's no startups that happen overnight. And frankly, you don't know how long that's going to be. And I don't think you want to go into this without a clue, without an idea of like how long you can sustain this level of uncertainty and no pay. So you want to calculate what your personal runway is. And to me, that is just like, how much does it cost to keep up your current lifestyle? Now, the reality is you probably should curb your lifestyle a little bit. And again, I am not here to make moral judgments. It is up to you what you want to do here. But from a practical standpoint, you probably are going to cut back on some things and you want to know how long that's going to take. If your personal runway is less than 3 months, you should really rethink whether you want to take this risk or not, or you need to significantly cut down your lifestyle. I don't know how many startups hit some point where they like get funding and make enough money so that you can pay yourself in the first 3 months. But that percentage is like sub 1%, sub 2%. It is not a percentage that you should count on. What's more realistic is ideally you have a personal runway of like almost a year, right? And 9 months to a year, if possible, because it takes a long time to kind of figure out what you're working on. And honestly, the first 3 months is like going to just be figuring that out. So you can make your own decisions about how long is enough. Some people want 2 years. Some people are okay with shorter. It kind of depends on your life and whether you have family and that kind of thing. But I think the important thing is you want to know what your number is. And so you can go in when you're making this decision with actual information about how long you can kind of do this. So please go calculate your personal runway and have some kind of like tough and honest conversations about what you can and cannot do here. The 5th thing, which I think is related to the personal runway, is you want to be able to set some goals and timeline. So this, for me, is specifically targeting the whole unstructured part of doing a startup. I think the mistake a lot of founders make is they go in, they say, okay, I'm going to start a startup. And they have no goals and no timeline for what milestones they're trying to hit. A more productive way to tackle this is to say something like, okay, in the first month, I want to have accomplished X. In 3 months, I want to have accomplished Y. And then in 6 months, I want to accomplish Z. And the reason why this is such a helpful kind of like thing is, again, you want to have these before you make the decision because you want to pick this timeline and these goals such that if you hit these goals and timelines, you're going to feel good about your decision and that you feel like you're on track. It's a really hard thing to do in startups. You have no idea whether you're on track or not because you're just singularly working by yourself. And so you want to build these structures yourself, even if they're frankly kind of arbitrary. I know I'm going to get some emails. People are like, what should be the first month goal? How many users should that be? And I don't have an answer for you. Every startup is totally different. And I think the way that you want to make decisions in the early days when you don't know what they should be is, what would you feel good about? So if you spend your first month and you accomplish X, would you feel good about that? Would you feel like, okay, I feel like I'm on the right track? And that's the thing that you want to use as your like North Star to do that. Okay, does that sound kind of silly? Because, frankly, if it's your first time, what do you know about kind of like pace and progress? A lot of the first couple of months of starting a startup is actually managing your own emotions around kind of like the experience of doing a startup. And so I think setting goals to sway your kind of emotions and make you kind of feel good is perfectly justified. So I think that's totally appropriate. And so I think you should do this before you go in. Examples of kind of like maybe what it is, again, it's going to be different for everybody. Maybe the first month is like, I get 25 users and I do 10 user interviews, right? And so like that is your target, your first month, that's all you're doing. And then look, maybe your third month is like, okay, I get 200 users and I do 25 user interviews. That's it. And I like these sort of goals because you want to have goals that are binary. Like, whether you did them or that you didn't. And that's just going to help you again with kind of like the structure and that kind of stuff. And so setting goals and a timeline for when you're going to hit these. Try to be as concrete as possible. That's going to help you with the unstructured part of that. So 5 things on my checklist. The first one, which is the precursor, you should not do any of the other stuff. If you haven't done this one, please validate your idea. Convince yourself that this is something that you should is worth quitting your job. Number 2, you want to understand your motivations. Why are you starting a startup? Are they externally motivated, internally motivated? Get a really good understanding of yourself. It's going to get put to the test. Third part, if you can, it's not necessary, but you're better off finding a co-founder. We're going to go much deeper into this, but for a lot of the reasons that I talked about in what the first 3 months are going to be, co-founder helps with this. Number 4, calculate a personal runway. Try to get an understanding of how long you can go without making any money. Hopefully it's closer to a year than it is kind of like 3 months and a month. Then the 5th part is set a goal and timeline for what you want to accomplish in, first month, first 3 months, first 6 months. It's really going to help you, give you a North Star for all the unstructured kind of like self-discipline that you're going to be dealing with. I'm sure there's many more things that people can come up with, but these are the kind of like top 5 things that I would recommend people do before they start a startup. I think the benefit of doing a startup, even if it doesn't work out, and look, hopefully it works out for everybody, but the benefit of this too, and I encourage everyone to do it, is, I said this at some point during this episode, it has been the source of the most learning that I've had in my entire life. And I think for a lot of people who have come from different roles in larger companies and that kind of stuff, they often will say that the things they learned doing a startup, it's like 3 years of experience other places compressed into one, right? And so I think there's a lot of value in that. And maybe I'll make the pitch that I often pitch people. Here's the pitch that I gave people who had never worked at a startup before to work at my startup. And I think the same is kind of true for being a founder. So the pitch goes like this. This works every time. Whatever job that you have now, it's likely you can get that job again. You have it now. You're probably pretty good at that job. You can likely get that job now, right? So your worst case scenario, you can get your job again. So if that's your worst case scenario, you should take risk, right? Because the downside of taking the risk is you just get your job again, which is actually where you are right now. And the upside is you get this, for me, kind of wonderful experience, despite how kind of horrible I kind of described it to be in the first 3 months, but this kind of wonderful experience. And at the very best case, you start this company that is meaningful to a lot of people, and you get this grand adventure. And I think if you ask me what's been the most meaningful part of starting a startup, is that I feel like I've gone on this grand adventure and continue to go on this grand adventure, and I've learned a lot, and I've met people that's really interesting from it. And I just think that that's all kind of absolutely kind of worth it. So in the worst case, you end up at the job that you have now. And in the best case, you go on this grand adventure and you learn a lot, and your life is kind of changed. And so, to me, it's probably is the reason why I do other things too. It's kind of a no-brainer thing, despite everything I said. And even though it's a no-brainer thing, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't prepare and you shouldn't kind of do the right stuff. You should absolutely prepare. You should absolutely do the right stuff. But also kind of know that, there's kind of this kind of wonderful part of this afterwards.